Between 1853 and 1854, a quiet terror crept through the plantations of Burke County, Georgia, along the winding banks of the Ogeechee River. The official records of that time tell a simple story: 9 white overseers who moved west, or relocated. But in the swamps and quarters of enslaved people, whispered tales carried a darker truth. They spoke of a pale figure who prowled through the cypress groves at night, of screams echoing through the fog, and of human skin found stretched like leather deep in the swamps. The enslaved population called him Devil's White, a name uttered only in secret when the overseers were far away. History wrote their vanishings as migration, but those who lived in bondage knew better. The story began in the autumn of 1853, when the first whispers of something unnatural disturbed the brutal peace of Burke County's plantations. The Georgia lowlands in the 1850s were a world of contradictions. The beauty of the Ogeechee River, its mirror-like surface reflecting the canopy of cypress and tupelo trees, hid the horror that powered its prosperity. Rice plantations lined its banks, where enslaved Africans worked waste, deep in fetid water from dawn till nightfall, cultivating the crop that enriched their owners. In Burke County, human bondage was not just an economic system, it was the foundation of daily life. Enslaved people outnumbered their white masters by nearly 10 to 1, and every acre of cotton and rice was watered with their blood and labor. Among these estates stood the Calhoun Plantation, 3,000 acres of swamp, field, and forest, owned by Jeremiah Calhoun, a man who preferred the comfort of his Savannah townhouse to the brutal realities of his property. Calhoun visited rarely, leaving the day-to-day operations to his overseers, men drawn from the poorest ranks of white society who viewed cruelty as the only proof of authority. The Calhoun Plantation was a place where survival demanded silence. The rice fields were death traps, stagnant pools breeding mosquitoes, leeches, and disease. Dysentery, cholera, and malaria struck so often that Calhoun's ledger treated human loss as routine. Each overseer was tasked to extract the highest yield, regardless of the cost in lives or sanity. Whips, stocks, and iron collars were the tools of management. In this bleak hierarchy, even the overseers lived under pressure. Their authority came not from wealth, but from their power to inflict suffering on others. Among them, Thomas Greer was the most feared. At 43, with a reputation for firm management, he had turned cruelty into an art form. Those under him learned that defiance meant death. To the enslaved, he was not just a man. They called him the Lash Made Flesh. In late October 1853, a new slave arrived under peculiar circumstances. The county records listed him only as male, 28, albino, field hand, origin, Chatham County. No name, no family, no past, only property transferred from one hell to another. Among the enslaved, he came to be called Silas, though whether he chose the name or accepted it from others, no one could say. His appearance alone marked him as different. His skin was ghostly pale, without a trace of color. His eyes were a washed-out blue that watered in the daylight, forcing him to squint constantly, and his hair was white and fine, unlike the dark curls of those around him. Complete albinism was rare among any people, but on a plantation where darkness of skin defined bondage, his pallor was seen as both curse and omen. Some whispered that he was touched by spirits, others that the devil himself had stolen his color. To both slave and master, Silas's existence seemed unnatural. The sparse documents that accompanied him from Chatham County hinted at a troubled history. He had been sold 4 times in 6 years, always after incidents described vaguely as difficulty with management or unsuitability for cooperative labor. One entry from 1851 stood out. Subject displays extreme resistance to correction. 2 overseers injured during discipline. Recommend sale to interior plantation for isolation. It was a bureaucratic way of describing rebellion. Whatever had happened before, it followed Silas to Burke County. When Silas arrived at Calhoun's plantation, Thomas Greer regarded him with cold fascination. Greer saw in the pale man not just difference, but defiance waiting to be broken. He assigned Silas to the rice fields, the most punishing labor imaginable. There, under the relentless Georgia sun, Silas's fragile skin burned and blistered within hours. His raw flesh split open from constant immersion in muddy water, the wounds refusing to heal. Yet he did not cry out. Even when the pain must have been unbearable, he worked in silence, his expression unreadable. To Greer, that silence was insolence. On the third day, when Silas failed to complete his quota, Greer ordered him tied to a post and whipped before the assembled workers. 20 lashes cut into his pale flesh, but still he made no sound. When the beating ended, Silas stood, blood streaking his back, and walked away without limping, without a word. Those who witnessed it whispered that something inside him was different, something that did not break. As weeks passed, plantation life returned to its mechanical rhythm of dawn labor, midday punishment, and night confinement. Winter crept over the rice fields, bringing cold relief to Silas's scorched skin, but replacing heat with the misery of icy water. Still, he endured. Some nights, people noticed he would vanish after dark, slipping into the cypress groves that bordered the fields. Those swamps were places no one entered willingly, filled with snakes, quicksand, and ghost stories that kept even the bravest enslaved men close to their quarters. Yet Silas went and always returned before morning, his face unreadable, his hands clean but his eyes distant. No one knew what he did in the darkness. Some said he prayed to spirits. Others said he spoke with something that lived in the swamp. On Christmas week, when work paused briefly for the illusion of mercy, an older woman named Delilah, one of the plantation cooks, found Silas sitting alone near the quarters. She had survived decades of bondage through quiet observation and careful words. She approached him cautiously. "They say you've been sold 4 times, she murmured. "They say overseers get hurt where you go." Silas didn't look at her at first. "Trouble finds me," he said softly. "I don't go looking for it." Delilah warned him to bury whatever anger lived inside him, to stay invisible. "Anger gets us killed," she whispered. But Silas finally met her gaze, his pale eyes glinting in the moonlight. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe anger's the only thing that keeps us alive." Delilah felt a cold shiver run through her, as though she'd heard something both human and beyond human. And then, barely 2 weeks later, the first overseer vanished. In early January of 1854, the rhythm of the Calhoun plantation was broken by the unexplained disappearance of Wade Parsons, one of Thomas Greer's assistant overseers. Parsons was a man known for his punctual cruelty, famous for beginning each morning by whipping someone as an example to the others. When he failed to appear one cold morning, it was first met with irritation, not alarm. Greer assumed drunkenness or negligence until a search revealed that Parsons had vanished entirely. His cabin showed no struggle, his rifle still leaned against the wall, his coat on its peg, and a half-eaten meal on the table, as if he had simply stood up and walked into thin air. Greer organized a search with a handful of overseers and a group of enslaved men forced to assist. They scoured the swamp edges, rice paddies, and nearby woods, but found nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no sign of a body. By nightfall, the only certainty was absence. In the hierarchy of slavery, white overseers were supposed to embody control, yet Parsons's disappearance hinted that something stronger, something unseen, had entered their world. Greer sent a message to Jeremiah Calhoun in Savannah, describing the event as an unfortunate accident and speculating that Parsons had fallen into the river or been attacked by wildlife. To the enslaved people, however, it was a different story. They remembered how Parsons had screamed at Silas the day before, how the pale man had endured his insults in silence, and how, by morning, the overseer was gone. Whispers spread in the quarters that night, not of fear but of quiet satisfaction. 3 weeks later, when another overseer named Daniel Carmichael disappeared under identical circumstances, the whispers turned to certainty. Carmichael had been seen patrolling the rice fields near dusk. By morning, his bed was untouched, his rifle still propped by the door. There were no tracks, no broken branches, no evidence of flight or fight. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. This time, Greer's confidence faltered. He doubled the night patrols, ordered torches lit along the fields, and interrogated workers with increasing brutality. Yet despite his rage, he could not shake the sense that the cause of these vanishings was beyond his understanding. The overseers began traveling in pairs, never alone. They carried guns even to meals, their voices lower, their eyes darting toward the swamps, as if the trees themselves were listening. The enslaved people, though cautious, sensed a shift. For once it was the white men who lived in fear. By mid-March 2 more overseers, Robert Finch and George Talbert, were gone. They had been on night watch together, assigned to patrol near the slave quarters. When dawn came, neither reported in. Their rifles were found leaning against a tree at the edge of the cypress grove, placed there neatly, almost ritualistically. No blood, no struggle, no footprints. Just the weapons, waiting like offerings. The disappearances now numbered 4, and panic began to bloom inside Greer's mind. For the first time, he felt the weight of powerlessness that his victims had known all their lives. He sent another urgent letter to Calhoun, demanding that the owner return immediately. Until help arrived, he ruled through terror. Enslaved people were forbidden to leave their quarters after dark. Guards were posted at every door, and anyone caught wandering was threatened with death. The overseers, their authority shaken, lashed out violently to reassert dominance, and the plantation became a landscape of pain and suspicion. Yet the more blood Greer spilled, the less control he seemed to have. Even his fellow whites began to whisper that something unnatural haunted the Calhoun land. When Jeremiah Calhoun finally returned in late March, he brought 2 hired guards and his secretary, determined to restore order. The meeting between master and overseer was tense. Greer, his face drawn and eyes sleepless, laid out the facts. The vanishings, the failed searches, the eerie silence that followed each disappearance. "They're scared," he said quietly, "but not of us, of something else." Calhoun, desperate to preserve the illusion of control, refused to involve local authorities. Public scandal meant financial ruin. Together, they devised a secret plan. Greer would hire new overseers from outside the county, men unaware of the plantation's cursed reputation, while offering a false promise of freedom to any enslaved person who revealed information about the disappearances. The hope was to sow division, to make fear do their work for them. By early April, 3 new overseers arrived: Marcus Sloan, Raymond Dodd, and Henry Fletcher. They were hard men from South Carolina, veterans of plantation brutality, and they laughed at the nervous tension that hung over the place. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The routine resumed, the fields filled with laborers, the whips cracked, and for a fleeting moment, Greer believed the nightmare had passed. But on April 22nd, Marcus Sloan went missing. Unlike before, this time it happened in daylight. He had been inspecting the rice fields, surrounded by workers, yet no one saw him leave. When Greer led a search, they found only a disturbed clearing deep in the cypress grove. The earth was churned, the trees bore deep gouges marked with what looked like dried blood, and drag marks vanished into the swamp. There was still no body. The sight made even the hardest men shudder. Greer felt something cold settle inside him, the first whisper of dread that this was not merely murder. It was retribution. That night, the interrogations began. Greer's desperation turned to cruelty without restraint. Dozens were tortured. Some never survived. He demanded to know who had killed the overseers, but every cry of pain brought only silence. Finally, one old man named Caesar, too weak for field work, mentioned that he had often seen Silas walking into the grove after dark. Greer seized on the name like a drowning man on driftwood. Silas was brought from his quarters, beaten and chained, his frail body still marked by burns and lashes from past punishments. In the flickering light of torches, Greer demanded answers. Silas said nothing. The whip fell again and again, tearing his skin until his back was a mass of blood, but he made no sound. Even when the iron was heated and pressed against his flesh, his face remained calm, almost peaceful. The men torturing him began to tremble, not from pity but from unease. Something about his silence seemed inhuman. "He's not a man," Fletcher muttered. "No man can take that." When the torture finally ended, Silas hung unconscious but alive. He was dragged back to the quarters, left bleeding and barely breathing. That night, as the moon rose over the swamps, Raymond Dodd and Henry Fletcher, the same men who had whipped him, vanished from their posts without a trace. By dawn, the plantation was a nightmare of chaos. 7 overseers were gone. Greer, Calhoun, and the few remaining whites barricaded themselves in the main house, their guns ready, their sleep haunted by every creak and whisper. Outside, the enslaved people moved carefully, unsure what would come next. For the first time, there were no orders, no voices commanding them to the fields. Delilah, the cook, went to check on Silas and found only an empty bed soaked with blood, but no body. He had vanished as if the night itself had claimed him. Some believed he had died and been taken by spirits. Others believed he had risen to finish what he started. The swamps around the Calhoun plantation grew quiet that morning, heavy with mist, as though holding its breath for what was yet to come. The morning after Silas's disappearance brought no peace to the Calhoun plantation. The world seemed unnaturally still, the air heavy as if the swamp itself waited for something to unfold. Inside the main house, Thomas Greer and Jeremiah Calhoun sat with their rifles laid across their knees, eyes fixed on the windows as though expecting the shadows outside to move. They were now 5 white men surrounded by more than 200 enslaved people, all of whom watched in silence. The structure that had ruled this land, fear, control, obedience, was cracking. Calhoun, pale and trembling, urged Greer to abandon the plantation and flee to Savannah for help, but Greer refused. To leave, he argued, would be to lose everything. The enslaved population was property worth a fortune, and if they fled into the swamps, there would be no recovering them. For the first time, the master and the overseer were united not by dominance but by fear of losing control. As the day wore on, Greer's frustration hardened into a dangerous resolve. If words or torture could not expose the truth, perhaps open threat would. That afternoon, Greer ordered one of Calhoun's guards to fire several shots into the air, summoning every enslaved person to gather in front of the main house. They came slowly, uncertain and wary, forming a silent crowd before the steps. Men, women, and children stood together, their faces blank masks, hiding a mixture of terror and curiosity. For years they had stood in that same place to witness punishment and death, but now they came for something different, though none of them yet knew what. Greer stepped out onto the porch, his face drawn, his eyes wild from sleepless nights. 7 white men are gone, he shouted. Somebody here knows why. I'll make this plain. Anyone who tells me where they are, anyone who leads me to the one responsible, will have their freedom, legal freedom, papers and safe passage. You have until sundown. His voice cracked as he spoke the word freedom, a word he had never before uttered as a promise. When no one responded, his tone darkened. If no one speaks, he said, I'll burn these quarters to the ground with every last one of you inside. The crowd remained silent. Not one voice rose to plead or confess. They simply looked back at him, calm, waiting, united in their silence. For the first time, Greer realized how powerless he was when no one obeyed. He turned and stormed back inside the house, trembling not from anger, but from the sense that the world he ruled was slipping away. Evening fell slowly that day, the sun sinking behind the cypress groves, casting long shadows that stretched across the fields like dark fingers. The enslaved people returned to their quarters, whispering in small groups, trying to understand what would happen next. Many spoke of Silas, of his calm under torture, of how his wounds could not have allowed him to walk, and yet he was gone. Some believed he had died, and his spirit now walked the swamp. Others thought he had become something more than human, the embodiment of their pain and vengeance. A few said that maybe, for once, God himself had sent a hand of justice. As the light faded, a young enslaved boy named Caleb, just 16, made a decision that would change everything. Driven by fear, greed, or perhaps the faint hope of real freedom, he walked to the main house and knocked. When Greer's guard dragged him inside, the boy kept his eyes low. "I seen something," he said, his voice trembling. "I seen the pale one, Silas, going into the cypress grove at night. I seen him carrying things, heavy bundles, looked like sacks or maybe bodies. He went deep, where the ground's too wet for most folks to walk." Greer leaned forward, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in days. "You can take us there?" he asked. Caleb nodded, hesitant but certain. "Before dark, sir," he added softly. "Once night comes, that swamp ain't fit for any man." Greer looked out the window at the dimming horizon, weighing his choices. To wait for morning was to invite another night of terror. To go now was madness. But the promise of ending it, of finally facing the thing that haunted his land, was too tempting. He decided they would go immediately. Calhoun, pale and sweating, refused to accompany him, insisting he would stay behind with one guard to protect the house. "If we're not back by dawn," Greer said grimly, "ride for Savannah." With that, he, Caleb, and the remaining guard, Patterson, set out toward the grove. Each man carried a rifle and knife, Greer also taking a torch, though he hoped not to use it. Behind them, from the slave quarters, dozens of silent faces watched them disappear into the trees. The swamp swallowed sound. The path Caleb led them down was little more than a narrow depression between thick roots and stagnant pools, the air filled with the heavy scent of decay. Spanish moss hung from branches like veils, and somewhere unseen, frogs croaked in endless rhythm. As they moved deeper, the light faded to a bruised twilight, the torch flickering weakly against the gathering dark. Greer's boots sank into mud with every step, and his breath came short. "How much farther?" he muttered. Caleb's voice floated back to him. "Not far, sir. There's a clearing up ahead." The path widened suddenly, and the swamp opened into a circular space of drier ground, surrounded by towering trees. What stood in its center froze all three men in place. At first, the shape was unrecognizable. A tall framework built from interlocked cypress branches bound with strips of something that looked like leather. The structure stood nearly 8 feet high. Then the torchlight caught the objects hanging from it, 9 shapes, pale and swaying gently in the evening breeze. Greer stepped closer, his stomach turning as realization set in. They were human skins, stretched and cured like hides in a tanner's shop. Faces still intact, hands and feet preserved, even the faint patterns of hair visible. The air stank faintly of rot and something chemical, the sharp odor of tanning oils. Greer recognized the scar on one arm, Wade Parsons, and the tattoo of an anchor that had once decorated Robert Finch's forearm. Each missing overseer was there, their bodies turned into trophies. Patterson gagged and vomited into the mud. Caleb stood rigid, his face drained of color. Greer's hands shook violently as he raised his rifle, scanning the tree line. "We're leaving," Patterson whispered. "We have to go." Before Greer could answer, Caleb spoke in a trembling voice. "He's here." Greer turned toward where the boy stared, and there, at the edge of the clearing, stood Silas. His white skin glowed faintly in the dying light, his wounds from the torture still raw but not bleeding. He held a long knife at his side, and his pale eyes shone like mirrors. "Put it down," Greer ordered, his rifle raised. "It's over." Silas didn't move. Patterson lifted his weapon, but his hands were unsteady. The stillness stretched until it seemed the world itself was holding its breath. Then Patterson fired. The shot tore through the air, missing wildly. In the instant of smoke and echo, Silas moved. He was impossibly fast, a blur of white cutting through the shadows. Before Patterson could reload, the knife flashed and blood sprayed across the clearing. Patterson fell, throat opened cleanly from ear to ear. Greer fired his rifle, but Silas was gone, his shape slipping between the hanging skins, the shadows swallowing him whole. Greer stumbled backward, drawing his pistol, heart pounding so hard it drowned every sound but his own breath. "You can't run," came Silas's voice, calm and almost tender. "This place is mine. You already know what waits for you." Greer turned and fled, crashing through the swamp in blind panic, the torch falling from his hand, its light dying in the black water. Behind him, he heard footsteps, sometimes near, sometimes far, and then nothing but silence. When he stopped at last, gasping for breath, he realized he was lost. In that silence, a soft touch fell on his shoulder. He turned, and there was Silas, his eyes gleaming with reflected moonlight. "Please," Greer whispered, all the cruelty gone from him now. "Please don't." Silas's expression was unreadable. "Did they say please?" he asked quietly. "The ones you whipped, the women you hurt, the children you sold?" Greer tried to lift his pistol, but his hands would not obey him. The knife flashed once more, silver in the moonlight, and then the swamp was silent again. Caleb ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out. The swamp seemed endless, the air thick with the smell of decay and the cries of unseen creatures echoing in the dark. Behind him, the world had fallen silent. No more gunshots, no more shouting, only the memory of blood and that white figure moving faster than any man should. When he burst out of the cypress grove and saw the lights of the main house, he screamed for help, his voice high and desperate. Jeremiah Calhoun, sitting armed and sleepless behind the barred door, heard the sound and recognized the raw terror in it. Against his better judgment, he unbarred the door just long enough to let Caleb stumble inside before slamming it shut again. The boy collapsed to the floor, gasping, mud and swamp water dripping from his clothes, eyes wide with the memory of what he had seen. Calhoun knelt beside him, shaking him by the shoulders. "Where is Greer? Where's Patterson?" he demanded. Caleb tried to speak, but his words came out broken, choked by panic. It took several minutes before he could form a coherent sentence, and when he finally did, his story made Calhoun's blood run cold. In halting phrases, Caleb described the clearing, the framework of cypress branches, the skins hanging like trophies, the stench of death, and how Silas had appeared out of the darkness, moving like a ghost, silent and unstoppable. He told how Patterson had been killed before Greer fired and ran, and how the swamp had swallowed them both. Calhoun stared at him in disbelief, but the boy's trembling hands and wild eyes left no room for doubt. Whatever had taken the overseers was no ordinary killer. For a long time, Calhoun said nothing. He poured himself a drink, his hand shaking so hard the liquor spilled onto the floorboards. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, thick and suffocating. He realized then that the plantation, his fortune, his very sense of the world's order, all of it, was collapsing. For the first time in his life, Jeremiah Calhoun understood fear not as something he wielded, but as something that held him captive. The two of them, Calhoun and the terrified Boyce, spent that night in a kind of waking nightmare. The house creaked and settled, the wind whispering through cracks in the shutters. Every sound made them flinch. At one point, long after midnight, they heard scratching at the front door, faint but deliberate, like fingernails dragging across the wood. It lasted several minutes, then stopped, only to begin again at a window. Calhoun raised his rifle and peered through the shutters, but the yard beyond was dark and still. There was nothing to see, but he could feel something watching, waiting. Caleb huddled in a corner, his eyes squeezed shut, murmuring prayers under his breath. When the scratching finally stopped, silence returned, thick, unnatural, as if even the night creatures were holding their breath. Near dawn, new sounds drifted through the walls, voices, many of them, coming from the direction of the quarters. Calhoun risked another glance outside. In the growing gray light, he saw movement. Dozens of enslaved men and women were gathering near the path that led to the cypress grove. Their posture wasn't fearful. It was curious, expectant. They spoke to one another in low tones, but there was an energy among them, something that made Calhoun's stomach twist. He waited, gripping his rifle, unsure whether to bar the windows or run. Then he saw them part, forming a silent path as someone approached from the trees. Silas stepped out of the morning mist. He was bare, chested, his pale skin streaked with dried blood and mud, the wounds from his torture still visible but no longer bleeding. In his arms he carried a bundle wrapped in cloth. As he walked, the crowd made space for him, no one daring to touch or even speak. The only sound was the crunch of his feet on the packed earth and the faint rustle of cloth in his hands. When Silas stopped 20 feet from the porch, he looked up at Calhoun. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost gentle. "Mr. Calhoun," he said, "I brought you something." He set the bundle on the ground and unfolded it carefully. Inside lay the severed head of Thomas Greer. The face was locked in an expression of horror, eyes wide, mouth open as if frozen mid-scream. The crowd gasped softly, but no one moved. Silas straightened, his pale eyes reflecting the morning light. "This plantation ran on fear," he said. "You used it to break us, to make us forget we were human. Now you understand what real fear feels like." Calhoun lifted his rifle, hands trembling. Around him, the enslaved people shifted uneasily, some stepping forward as if to protect Silas, others retreating in confusion. Silas did not flinch. "You can shoot me," he said, "but it won't bring your men back. It won't give you your power again. This place is finished, Mr. Calhoun. You just haven't accepted it yet." For a long moment the world seemed to pause. Calhoun's finger rested on the trigger. In his mind he saw the system his life depended on, his wealth, his status, his place among the planters, all built upon obedience enforced by terror. Yet now, staring at the sea of faces before him, he saw only quiet defiance. The illusion of control was broken. Even if he shot Silas, what then? He was one man against hundreds who no longer feared him. Slowly, Calhoun lowered his rifle. Silas nodded once, as if in recognition of a truth finally spoken. Then he turned and walked back toward the grove, the crowd silently parting once more to let him pass. He disappeared into the mist, leaving the plantation in a silence more powerful than any gunshot. When the sun rose higher, Calhoun's secretary returned from Savannah with 20 soldiers and the county sheriff. They found the plantation paralyzed. The enslaved people were still there, standing near the fields or clustered by their quarters, but none were working. No one gave orders and no one obeyed. Calhoun sat on the porch, his face gray, the rifle still across his lap. When questioned, he told a partial truth, that 10 overseers had disappeared or been killed, that an enslaved man had gone mad and fled into the swamps. The sheriff organized a search, but the soldiers found only horror. Deep in the cypress grove, they discovered the clearing Caleb had described, the framework still standing, the 9 skins hanging where Silas had left them. They found Patterson's body, throat slit, and Greer's headless corpse half submerged in black water. The other overseers were never found. The soldiers burned the skins and tore down the structure, but the smell lingered, an odor that clung to the air like memory. The manhunt for Silas lasted weeks. Patrols swept through the swamps, dogs tracked scent trails that led nowhere, and rumors spread faster than truth. Some claimed he had died from his wounds, his body sinking into the marsh to be devoured by alligators. Others swore they saw a pale figure moving through the cypress trees at night, watching, waiting. The soldiers never found him. By summer, the plantation stood empty of authority. No new overseers would take the position, for the tale of Devil's White had already spread through Georgia. The property's value collapsed, its fields turned wild. Within a year, Calhoun sold the enslaved people individually to distant plantations and abandoned the land itself. The main house was left to rot, eventually burning years later under mysterious circumstances. The story, however, did not die. Across the South, whispers of the albino slave who killed 9 overseers spread from plantation to plantation. To the enslaved, it became a legend of justice, a tale of vengeance born from unbearable cruelty. To the planters, it was a warning that their power was built on fear so deep it could summon monsters. Historians would later find records that Silas had once been trained as a tanner, skilled in preserving hides. That single note explained the precision of the horrors in the grove, yet it did little to dull the fear that lingered long after his disappearance. The swamps reclaimed the Calhoun land, the cypress grove thickened with vines and silence, and those who lived nearby swore that on still nights, when the fog rolled in from the river, they could see a pale figure moving among the trees, his eyes reflecting the moonlight, his steps soundless over the water. Years passed, but the shadow of what had happened on the Calhoun plantation refused to fade. By the time the 1860s arrived, nature had already begun to reclaim the land. The rice fields lay flooded and overgrown with wild reeds, the wooden quarters stood half-collapsed, and the main house, stripped of furniture and memory, loomed like a hollow skull at the heart of the plantation. Locals avoided it. Travelers passing along the Ogeechee River spoke of hearing screams echoing through the cypress groves on misty nights, of seeing flickers of pale light drifting between the trees. They said it was the ghost of the albino slave, Devil's White, still haunting the land where he had spilled so much blood. Whether out of superstition or genuine dread, no one settled there again. The story of Silas had become legend, yet the fear it carried felt real enough to keep even the boldest men away. In the decades following the Civil War, Burke County changed, but not as much as it liked to pretend. The old plantations were broken into smaller farms. The men who had once owned hundreds of people now reduced to scraping a living from ruined soil. Freedom had come, but it brought hunger with it. Many of the newly freed people stayed near the places they had once been enslaved because they had nowhere else to go. They shared stories as they worked, stories of pain, endurance, and the strange justice that had once visited Calhoun's land. The elders told the tale of Silas around fires at night, the pale man who had suffered every cruelty and yet turned that suffering into something that struck fear into those who thought themselves untouchable. For them, the story was not just horror, it was balance. It was the idea that even in the darkest system, there was a limit to what could be endured before something, human or not, rose to answer. By the 1890s, the Calhoun property was little more than a rumor marked on old maps. The swamp had swallowed much of it, and vines covered what remained of the buildings. A logging company bought the land cheaply, believing it held valuable cypress timber. When the first crews arrived, they built a camp near the edge of the grove, laughing off the warnings of nearby farmers. On their first day, they worked without incident, though the men complained that the air in the grove felt wrong, heavy and too quiet. On the second day, one worker failed to return from the inner swamp. Searchers found his tools laid neatly by a tree, but no trace of the man himself. The foreman ordered everyone out of the woods until the missing worker was found. That night, men in the camp swore they saw a pale figure standing among the trees, watching them without moving. In the morning, 2 more workers quit and refused to come back. Within a week, the company abandoned the operation entirely, declaring the grove inaccessible. They wrote it off as a loss, but word of what they'd seen spread. In the nearby towns, old people shook their heads and said the grove still belonged to Devil's White. A few years later, a traveling preacher named Ezekiel James claimed to have visited the site. He told his congregation in Augusta that he'd gone into the swamp seeking the truth behind the tales. He described feeling an oppressive silence, the kind that muffles footsteps and makes a man's heart race. Near what he believed to be the center of the grove, he found a small rise of ground still blackened as if by fire. The soil there, he said, had a strange smell, wheat and rotten, like old leather left to dry in the sun. He prayed, left a wooden cross, and hurried back to his boat. That night, as he slept in a nearby cabin, something scratched at his window until dawn. When he awoke, the cross he had planted was gone. Whether the story was true or simply another preacher's drama, it added to the legend. The grove had become a place people spoke of only in whispers, a boundary between the human world and something older, darker, and watching. By the turn of the 20th century, historians began to revisit the events of 1853-54, drawn by the surviving plantation records and the strange footnote. Buried in county archives, among these documents, one researcher discovered the bill of sale for Silas, dated 1853, from Chatham County to Jeremiah Calhoun. It described him as male, age 28, condition, albinism, and included a single additional note, trained tanner. That one word shed new light on everything. A tanner was a craftsman skilled in curing animal hides, in stripping flesh and preserving skin. Suddenly, the grotesque precision of the 9 overseers' remains made terrible sense. It wasn't madness that guided Silas's hands in the grove, it was expertise. This discovery horrified even those who had long considered the story to be mere myth. The historian who found the document, a woman named Mary Thurman, wrote in her 1923 journal, "It chills the blood to think that what we call legend might have been craft, learned skill turned to vengeance." She never published her findings formally, claiming the story was too gruesome for academic printing. Throughout the early 1900s, the tale of Devil's White continued to evolve in the oral histories of the descendants of both enslaved and free families. Interviews conducted by researchers during the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s captured these accounts in haunting fragments. One elderly woman who claimed to have been a child on a neighboring plantation when it all happened told her interviewer he wasn't no man like us. He was pain turned into something else. They made him, then he came back for what was owed. Another man, interviewed in 1938, said that his grandfather had once seen Silas's footprints by the river years after the plantation was abandoned. Bare prints pressed deep in mud that no rain ever seemed to wash away. These recollections blurred the line between history and myth, yet each carried the same undertone. Silas had not simply disappeared, he had become something enduring. Even local newspapers occasionally revived the story, usually as a curiosity printed near Halloween. Each retelling added new details. Some claimed Silas could move through water without leaving ripples. Others said his reflection never appeared in the river. The white residents of Burke County tended to treat the tale as a piece of morbid folklore, a ghost story that explained away an uncomfortable chapter of history. But for the black community, especially the descendants of the enslaved, the story remained something deeper, a symbol of retribution, a reminder that justice could take forms beyond human comprehension. In churches and at family gatherings, older generations would warn their children not to forget the name Silas, for he represented the part of them that refused to die. By the mid-20th century, the physical remnants of the plantation were nearly gone, but the fear lingered. Hunters who ventured too close to the grove sometimes reported losing their way in the mist, finding themselves walking in circles until dawn. Others claimed to hear faint cries or the crack of a whip echoing from nowhere. One man swore he saw a figure with skin as white as bone standing knee-deep in the swamp, watching him silently before vanishing into the fog. Each account reignited the legend. Locals began calling the area the Devil's Acre, and no one went there after dark. Scientists who later examined the land found nothing supernatural, only a mix of methane gas pockets and unusual magnetic activity that could distort compasses, but that explanation satisfied no one who had felt the oppressive stillness of the grove. Time continued to blur the boundaries between truth and myth, yet the story of Silas endured, as persistent as the humidity that hung over the Georgia swamps. To some, he was still a murderer, a ghost made of vengeance. To others, he was a hero, a man who struck back against the cruelty that defined his existence. And to many, he was simply an unanswered question, one that lingered in the damp air of Burke County every time the cypress groves filled with fog. The plantation was gone, the records fading, but the legend remained, whispering that in the deepest darkness of history, justice sometimes takes a shape that terrifies even those who create the need for it. By the middle of the 20th century, the Calhoun plantation had long been erased from Georgia's maps, but its story refused to vanish. The land where it once stood was a tangle of roots and stagnant pools, the kind of place where sound seemed to die before it reached the air. Locals spoke of it as cursed ground, where no crops would grow, and animals refused to linger. For years, no one dared to build there, but eventually, curiosity outweighed superstition. In the late 1950s, a group of surveyors arrived, sent by a timber company that had purchased a wide tract of land along the Ogeechee River. They laughed off the warnings of the old farmers who told them about Devil's White, dismissing the legend as ignorant folklore. The first few days of work went smoothly. They mapped the outer boundaries, took soil samples, and even discussed where to lay a road. But when they reached the edge of the cypress grove, the same grove that had once held Silas's horrific shrine, something changed. Their instruments malfunctioned, compasses spun in circles, radios lost their signal, and a heavy silence settled over the trees, thick and unnatural. By the third day, one of the men went missing. His boots were found standing neatly side by side at the edge of the grove, as though he had stepped out of them and walked barefoot into the swamp. His footprints continued for only a few yards before fading into nothing. The company shut down the project within a week, and the land was sold again, abandoned once more to the wilderness. In the decades that followed, the story of Devil's White became part of Burke County's identity, a tale whispered in schoolyards and retold by campfires. It was no longer just a story about vengeance or horror. It was a reflection of the past that people could not forget, even when they tried. For the descendants of the enslaved, it was history remembered through myth, a way to keep alive the truth that power built on suffering always collapses. For white residents, it was a haunting they could not explain away, a reminder that the sins of their ancestors had soaked into the soil. Even those who denied believing in ghosts still lowered their voices when speaking about the grove. They called it a place where time folds, as if the screams of the past still echoed somewhere just beyond hearing. By the 1970s, historians began to revisit the legend with new academic interest. The civil rights movement had reignited discussions about slavery, violence, and resistance, and Devil's White became a strange symbol of all three. Articles appeared in regional journals debating whether Silas had been a real man or a myth born from trauma. One historian from Atlanta University, Dr. Margaret Ellison, published a paper arguing that Silas was a collective creation, a figure forged from centuries of pain, embodying both human endurance and the fantasy of revenge. Yet, despite her careful reasoning, the story resisted dissection. The more scholars tried to categorize it, the more alive it seemed to become. Oral histories surfaced from elderly residents who swore their grandparents had known someone who saw the pale man long after the Civil War. A retired farmer claimed that as a boy he had wandered too close to the swamp and found a piece of old leather nailed to a tree, weathered, thin, and shaped eerily like a human hand. When he ran to fetch his father, the scrap was gone. As technology advanced, the legend adapted. By the 1990s, amateur ghost hunters with cameras and recorders began exploring the area. Some claimed to capture faint cries on audio tapes. Others photographed shapes that appeared human in the fog. Most were dismissed as tricks of light and imagination, but one video circulated quietly on early internet forums. A grainy clip of a pale figure standing motionless between two cypress trees, visible for only a moment before vanishing. The footage was too poor to prove anything, but it reignited the legend for a new generation. Paranormal enthusiasts dubbed the site the White Devil Swamp, and visitors began leaving offerings at its edge: coins, candles, and occasionally small pieces of tanned leather, though no one admitted placing them there. Local authorities eventually posted warning signs citing unstable ground and dangerous wildlife, but the signs only added to the mystery. Despite the ghost stories and investigations, the most haunting accounts still came from the descendants of those once enslaved on the Calhoun plantation. In church meetings and family reunions, elders spoke softly of Silas, never calling him Devil's White. That was the name outsiders used. To them, he was Silas the Tanner, a man who had endured and answered. They described him not as a monster, but as a spirit of reckoning, born from cruelty too great for one soul to contain. Some families passed down charms, Small leather strips, often dyed pale and knotted twice, which they said offered protection from injustice. Others said that if you went into the swamp at night and called Silas's name 3 times, the mist would move toward you, and you would hear footsteps that stopped just behind your shoulder. No one ever admitted testing it. By the early 2000s, Devil's White had crossed from local folklore into popular culture. Podcasters and documentary filmmakers rediscovered the story, weaving it into broader narratives about forgotten American horrors. One popular series even staged a nighttime investigation in the grove, though their footage showed nothing but darkness and the sound of water dripping from unseen branches. Still, the legend spread online, where it became part of the internet's vast archive of haunted places. Strangers debated whether Silas had been real or whether the story symbolized the psychological toll of slavery. Historians countered with records, skeptics pointed to hallucinations caused by swamp gases, and yet none of them could explain why, after nearly 2 centuries, locals still avoided the grove. Even satellite images of the area showed strange inconsistencies, shadows that shifted between captures, trails that appeared and vanished. Scientists dismissed it as the effects of changing water levels, but believers whispered that Silas still walked beneath the trees, watching the world that had once enslaved him continue to repeat its sins. In 2018, a research team from the University of Georgia conducted a survey of the site using ground-penetrating radar. Their goal was to locate remnants of the original plantation structures. The radar detected several anomalies beneath the soil, angular impressions consistent with the foundations of buildings, but one area, deep within the grove, produced results that baffled the scientists. The ground there seemed to reflect no signal at all, as if it absorbed everything sent into it. The team's equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, and one technician later described feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched. The data from that day was incomplete, corrupted beyond recovery. The team never returned. Through each generation, the story persisted because it contained something no one could fully name. It was not just horror, not only revenge, but an echo of guilt and resistance, tangled together like the roots of the cypress trees. Those who lived near the old plantation still said the grove changed with the seasons. Some nights it was silent and calm, other nights filled with faint weeping or laughter carried on the fog. And when the river rose high after heavy rains, old fragments sometimes washed up along its banks, bits of wood that looked carved by human hands, pieces of leather hardened by time, all pale as bone. Whether relics of Silas's vengeance or accidents of nature, no one could say. What mattered was that the land remembered. The Ogeechie's slow, winding water carried its ghosts patiently, and somewhere beneath the moss and mud, the story of the albino man who defied his masters still pulsed like a buried heartbeat. By the early 2020s, the legend of Devil's White had transcended its rural origins and become a point of fascination for historians, podcasters, and true crime enthusiasts across the internet. What had once been a whispered story told in the firelight of Burke County cabins was now being dissected in documentaries, academic articles, and late-night Reddit threads. Yet, beneath the layers of speculation and digital retelling, something about the original legend still resisted explanation. A local historical society in Waynesboro, hoping to separate truth from fiction, decided to fund a detailed investigation of the Calhoun property site. The team included historians, archaeologists, and 2 anthropologists who specialized in the study of trauma in post-slavery communities. Their approach was scientific, but all of them admitted a quiet unease about setting foot on the land. Even with satellite maps and GPS equipment, they couldn't shake the stories that had followed the place for more than a century. The team arrived in spring, when the Ogeechee River was swollen from weeks of rain. The cypress grove rose like a cathedral of decay, the ground soft and treacherous underfoot. They set up their camp near the edge, marking areas for excavation and ground study, From the very first night, strange incidents unsettled them. Their electronics drained inexplicably fast. Digital recorders clicked on by themselves, capturing hours of static and faint whispers that none of them remembered hearing. On the third night, one of the younger researchers, Olivia Harrow, swore she heard footsteps circling her tent, slow, measured, deliberate. When she unzipped the flap, no one was there, but a faint trail of pale mud marked the ground, leading back toward the grove. The next morning, the trail was gone, washed clean by dew. Despite their fear, the researchers continued. Within a week, they uncovered the stone foundations of what appeared to be the old overseer quarters. Among the debris, they found fragments of leather, hardened but unmistakably human in texture. Forensic testing would later confirm this horrifying detail, matching DNA markers to at least 2 different individuals of European descent. News of the discovery spread fast, stirring a storm of attention. The site was sealed off by the state for investigation, and for the first time in 170 years, Devil's White was treated not as legend, but as evidence. The media descended on Burke County, and locals, long wary of the attention, avoided interviews. Some feared that disturbing the site again would wake something best left buried. As archaeologists examined the grove, they noted another strange phenomenon. The soil in the exact area where the leather fragments were found was chemically unique. It contained unusually high levels of tannic acid, the same compound used in 19th century hide preservation. It was as if the very earth had absorbed the tools of Silas's craft. For the scientists, it was a fascinating anomaly. For the locals, it was proof that the ground still carried his spirit. Among them was an elderly man named Samuel Green, a descendant of the enslaved families who had lived under Calhoun. When interviewed by the press, he spoke slowly, his voice heavy with both reverence and warning. "That man, Silas? He said he ain't gone, he's part of this place now. Every time someone comes here thinking they can dig up his story, he reminds them what it cost to make it. The government halted all excavation by midsummer, citing preservation laws, but rumors claimed the real reason was that workers had begun." Refusing to return to the site, several reportedly experienced hallucinations, seeing flashes of white in the trees or hearing a man's calm voice whispering from nowhere. One technician quit after he found a fresh handprint pressed into the mud near his equipment. It was long, fingered, pale, and perfectly shaped, as though someone had just lifted their hand seconds before he arrived. The swamp, people said, had remembered Silas and was reawakening. Meanwhile, online fascination with the legend exploded. The recovered fragments became the centerpiece of a viral documentary titled The Tanner's Curse, which mixed fact and folklore into a chilling narrative. Some viewers treated it as entertainment. Others took it as confirmation that Silas was real. Social media filled with debates. Was he a spirit of vengeance, a victim of cruelty, or something in between? Amateur sleuths mapped old property records, tracing slave transactions and plantation boundaries, uncovering chilling details about the brutal conditions of Calhoun's land. In doing so, they inadvertently reignited the same moral question that had haunted the region for centuries: whether evil, once born from injustice, could ever truly die. The attention brought more visitors, though the locals begged them to stay away. Journalists, paranormal investigators, and thrill seekers ventured into the grove, many returning pale and shaken. One pair of college students who tried to camp overnight emerged the next morning unable to explain the scratches running down their backs, as though something had dragged its nails across them while they slept. Their camera, which had been recording, captured nothing but static from midnight until dawn, save for one brief sound, a low, rhythmic breathing close to the microphone. The footage went viral under the title "Breath of the White Devil." Most dismissed it as a hoax, but those who listened closely swore they heard words whispered under that breath. "This place is mine." Despite official denials, reports of strange occurrences multiplied. Flickering lights seen moving through the trees, distant cries echoing across the river. Even Sightings of a pale man standing knee-deep in the swamp at twilight. Local churches held prayer vigils, asking for protection, while younger residents treated it as a dare. Yet beneath the surface excitement, an old unease settled over Burke County. People began speaking again of curses and reckonings, of the idea that what Silas represented was not a ghost, but a wound that had never healed. For the older generation, the legend was a mirror reflecting centuries of cruelty, warning that the past could not be erased with denial. As autumn came, the state quietly fenced off the grove, declaring it an archaeological and protected site. But fences meant little to those who believed the place itself was alive. On misty nights, the fog still rolled out from the swamp and onto the nearby roads, pale and glowing, carrying the faint scent of tanned leather and smoke. Drivers passing through sometimes reported a figure standing by the water's edge, motionless, white as bone, watching. The police dismissed it as tricks of light and imagination, but the locals, shaking their heads, said the same words their ancestors had whispered for generations: Silas don't rest. By the end of that year, the legend of Devil's White had become both history and prophecy. Scholars continued to argue, skeptics continued to investigate, and believers continued to pray, but none could deny that the story had returned to life. The swamp still held its silence, the trees still wept their slow resin tears, and somewhere in that endless maze of water and roots, the spirit of the pale tanner waited, patient, watchful, timeless. The winter that followed was the coldest Burke County had seen in years. The Ogeechee River froze in thin sheets near its edges, and the cypress grove stood skeletal and gray, the swamp mist hanging like old breath over the water. The site was closed entirely now, fenced off and patrolled, but that did not stop people from talking. For months, speculation swirled online and in hushed conversations around town. Some said the state had found more remains and was keeping it secret. Others claimed that at night, lights still flickered inside the grove, though no one was supposed to be there. A few insisted that the legend of Devil's White was simply the land remembering, nature's way of ensuring that what happened there would never be forgotten. But the story did not end there. It was in that same winter that a final, strange discovery brought everything full circle. A historian named Dr. Amelia Rowan, who had worked with the original excavation team, returned to the site quietly, carrying her own unanswered questions. She had spent months studying the records recovered from Savannah's archives, plantation ledgers, court documents, even a shipment inventory of tanning supplies ordered by Jeremiah Calhoun in 1853. Among those papers, she had found something remarkable: a letter never before catalogued, its ink faded but legible. It was written by a man named Daniel Harker, a merchant who had sold Calhoun the tanning materials. The letter included a brief line that caught her breath. "Your new man Silas came by to fetch the barrels himself. Strange eyes, pale as chalk, but skilled hands. You'll find no better tanner." That one line, she realized, proved Silas had been real, and that his craft was not just inherited knowledge but recognized mastery. For Dr. Rowan, it was no longer about ghosts, but about a man whose pain had been twisted into legend by those who feared what they could not understand. Determined to uncover what remained of him, she returned to the grove one gray afternoon, accompanied only by her assistant. They stayed near the old foundations, where frost clung to the stones and the silence felt heavier than air. As she documented the site, her equipment began to fail. The camera flickered, her voice recorder hissed, and her GPS froze on a blank screen. She knelt to examine a patch of dark earth near the grove's center and noticed something buried just below the surface, a small leather pouch, hardened and sealed by time. She brushed the soil away carefully, her breath misting in the cold air. Inside the pouch was a folded scrap of parchment, brittle but intact. Written in faded ink were words that made her hand tremble as she read. "If they call me devil, then let them. I was made by their hands. My name was Silas. I take back what was stolen." For a long moment she could not move. The words were simple, but they burned with something deep: grief, defiance, truth. It wasn't a curse or a confession. It was a declaration written by a man who understood what history would do to him. Dr. Rowan felt the cold deepen, a stillness falling over the grove so complete that even the air seemed to hold its breath. She turned slowly, sensing movement in the fog. For an instant, she thought she saw a figure standing among the trees, tall, bare-chested, pale as the mist itself. The figure did not move or threaten. It only watched her, the faint glint of eyes like reflected moonlight. Then, as the fog shifted, it was gone. She stood there trembling, unsure if she had seen something real or if her mind, steeped in history, had conjured him. Either way, she understood. The story was not finished, because the truth it carried never really ended. Dr. Rowan left the grove at dusk, her steps slow and careful. She told no one about the figure, only about the letter and the pouch. Her report described the find as a personal note of historical significance, but privately, she knew it was something more, a voice that had survived when it should have been silenced. She returned to her university, gave one final lecture on the legend of Devil's White, and concluded with a line that stayed with her students long after she left the stage. What haunts us is not the ghost of one man, but the memory of what made him necessary. The audience sat in silence, the weight of her words pressing down like the swamp's fog. Weeks later, a local maintenance worker repairing the fence around the grove reported hearing footsteps behind him, though he was alone. He turned and saw nothing but mist curling between the trees. On his way back to his truck, he noticed something new hanging from the fence post, a strip of pale leather, clean and freshly cut, tied in a simple knot. He removed it and tossed it aside, thinking it a prank. By morning, the leather was gone. That night, heavy rain fell, and when dawn came, a single line was etched into the mud near the gate: Silas. It was gone by noon, washed away, but the story spread quickly. People said he had marked the land again, not in vengeance this time, but as a reminder that he remained. As years went on, Devil's White became more than a ghost story. It became a symbol of endurance. Artists painted him, authors reimagined his tale, and historians debated whether Silas was man, myth, or something beyond both. The grove was declared a National Historical Site, protected under federal law, though locals still refused to go near it after dark. Each year, on the anniversary of the original killings, the mist thickened over the swamp, and visitors claimed to hear soft singing drifting from the trees, a voice low and mournful, repeating a tune that no one could identify. Those who heard it said it was not terrifying but sad, like a man humming to himself after a long day's work. Some believed it was Silas, finally at peace. Others thought it was the land itself, grieving for everything it had witnessed. The legend of Silas endured not because of fear, but because it carried truth about cruelty, justice, and the cost of human pain. The story that began with chains and fire had become a warning carved into the heart of Georgia's soil, that the horrors of the past never stay buried, that the ghosts we create are the ones we deserve. And so the swamp remained, patient and timeless, the air thick with memory. The trees whispered when the wind moved through them, their voices blending with the sigh of the river. And sometimes, when the fog rolled in silver under the moonlight, those who listened closely swore they could hear footsteps in the shallows, slow, steady, deliberate, as though a pale figure still walked there, guarding the silence he had claimed long ago. That was how it ended, not with fire or screams, but with remembrance. Silas, the man they had called Devil's White, had become part of the land that made him. He was no longer feared by those who understood him, only respected. An echo that refused to fade, a truth that refused to die. And somewhere beneath the ancient cypress trees, where leather once hung and blood once stained the roots, the ground still breathed with his name.